He divorced her and 10 years later invited her to humiliate her again, but she shattered his life with twins and an unforgettable surprise. Hi, my beautiful family, may the Almighty bless you with peace in your homes, love in your hearts, and strength in every trial. Cherish your family, respect your partner, and raise your children with patience and care, because true wealth is love, not money. Please, my family, value this bond we share. Every story I bring is written with my heart for you. Stay with me till the end, because your support gives life to my work and strength to my soul. If your heart is true, write, present. If your love is real, write, I am with Mr. Peter. A heart shattered by betrayal can become a diamond, unbreakable, brilliant, and worth more than the fool who discarded it. The rain fell like tears from heaven on that October night 10 years ago, each drop against the window of their Georgetown townhouse echoing the sobs that Marilyn Dave couldn't contain any longer. At 25, she had believed in fairy tales, in forever, in the kind of love that poets wrote about and dreamers died for. Now, watching Sidney Potter fold his expensive shirts into leather suitcases with the cold efficiency of a man checking out of a hotel, she realized that some fairy tales were actually nightmares in disguise. This isn't working. Marilyn, Sidney said without looking at her, his voice carrying the hollow tone of a man who had already emotionally left months ago. We're different people than we were when we met. We want different things. Marilyn stood in the doorway of what had been their bedroom, wearing the silk nightgown he'd bought her for their last anniversary, the one where he'd seemed distracted, checking his phone during dinner, his mind clearly elsewhere, even as she tried to recapture the magic they'd once shared. Her dark skin glowed against the cream silk, her natural beauty as striking now as it had been the day he'd first seen her at Columbia's business school. But Sidney's eyes no longer held the wonder she remembered. The woman before him was breathtaking, 5'7" with curves that the silk nightgown accentuated perfectly, her dark curls falling like a waterfall around her shoulders, her brown eyes wide with tears that made them sparkle like stars. She had been his goddess once, the woman whose intelligence had first captured his attention and whose beauty had stolen his breath. But ambition had poisoned his heart, turning love into an obstacle to overcome rather than a treasure to cherish. "What different things?" she whispered, though her heart already knew the answer. She'd seen the way his eyes followed blonde, ambitious women at office parties. She'd noticed how he'd grown distant after his promotion, how success had changed him from the passionate young man who'd once written her love letters into someone who measured relationships by their utility to his career. Sidney finally looked at her, and for a moment, just a heartbeat, she saw something flicker in his blue eyes. Pain, regret, the memory of nights when they'd made love with desperate passion, when he'd whispered that she was his everything, when he'd traced her skin with reverent fingers and sworn he'd never need anything more than her love. But it vanished so quickly she might have imagined it. I need to focus on my career, on building something that matters. This domestic life, this playing house, it's not who I am, he said, the words coming out rehearsed, as if he'd practiced them in front of a mirror until they sounded convincing. The words hit her like physical blows. Playing house? As if their 5 years of marriage, their dreams of children and growing old together, their Sunday mornings making love until noon, and their whispered plans for the future had been nothing more than a game to him. As if the love she'd poured into their relationship, the way she'd given up her own career aspirations to support his, the dinners she'd cooked for his colleagues, the nights she'd massaged his shoulders while he stressed about presentations, had been worthless, disposable, easily discarded when something better came along. Is there someone else? The question escaped before she could stop it, though she already knew the answer from the guilt that flashed across his handsome features. She'd smelled unfamiliar perfume on his shirts, had seen the way his secretary Tiffany looked at him with predatory hunger, disguised as admiration. "What I do from this point forward isn't your concern anymore," he said, which wasn't a denial, and they both knew it. The coldness in his voice was like ice against her skin, freezing the last vestiges of hope in her chest. Marilyn wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold, despite the October warmth still lingering in the air. For weeks, she'd been feeling strange, tired, emotional, her body changing in subtle ways that made her wonder if the dreams they'd shared of starting a family were becoming reality. The missed periods, the morning nausea she'd attributed to stress, the tender breasts and strange, fluttering sensations in her belly that felt like butterflies taking flight. But looking at Sydney now, seeing the stranger wearing her husband's face, seeing how easily he could dismiss 5 years of love and passion and shared dreams, she knew she couldn't tell him. Not when he was walking away. Not when he'd already made his choice. Not when the words domestic obligations fell from his lips like curse words. "I loved you," she said quietly, her voice steady, despite the tears streaming down her face like rivers of heartbreak. "I loved you with everything I had. I would have given up anything for you, my career, my dreams, my independence. I did give those things up, believing we were building something together." The memory of their wedding day flashed between them. How handsome he'd looked in his tuxedo, how her heart had raced when he'd lifted her veil, how they'd danced to At Last, while he'd whispered that she was his miracle, his answered prayer, his forever. How young and foolish and beautifully naive she'd been to believe in forever, with a man who viewed love as a temporary convenience. Sydney's jaw tightened, the muscle ticking with the kind of tension that came from suppressing conscience. "That was your choice. It was our choice. Or so I thought." Marilyn moved to their wedding photo on the dresser, touching the frame with trembling fingers that remembered how he'd slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that shook with emotion. "Do you remember our vows? You promised to love me in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse. I guess this is the worst part and you're choosing to run. I'm not running. I'm evolving, growing, moving toward my potential instead of letting domestic obligations hold me back," he said. And there it was again, that clinical term that reduced their marriage to a burden, their love to a chain around his ambitious neck. The way he said it, domestic obligations, as if she were a mortgage payment or a gym membership he no longer wanted to maintain. As if the nights she'd held him when work stress made him cry, the mornings she'd made his favorite breakfast before important meetings, the evenings she'd listened to his dreams and fears and insecurities, had been nothing more than tasks she'd performed rather than love she'd given freely. Marilyn felt something inside her crystallize, harden into something unbreakable. She straightened her spine with the grace her grandmother had taught her, the dignity that no man, no matter how cruel, could strip away unless she let him. She looked at Sydney Potter with the measured gaze of a woman who'd just realized she'd been loving a mirage. "Then go," she said simply, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd found her strength in the midst of devastation. "Evolve, grow, discover your potential. But don't you ever pretend this was mutual. Don't rewrite history to make yourself feel better about abandoning your wife when she needed you most. You made a choice, Sydney Potter. Live with it." She walked to their bedroom door, her silk nightgown whispering against her skin like a prayer, pausing without turning around. Through the thin fabric, Sydney could see the silhouette of the body he'd once worshipped, the curves he'd traced with reverent hands, the woman who'd given him everything and was about to lose it all because of his cowardice. "I'll have my things moved out by the weekend. The house is yours. I never wanted it anyway. I wanted a home, and you can't buy that. You can only build it with someone who chooses to stay." The door closed behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo through the house like a death knell. Sydney stood alone in their bedroom, surrounded by packed suitcases and the ghost of a love he'd just murdered with his own hands. For a moment he almost called out to her, almost ran after her, almost chose love over ambition. But the moment passed, crushed under the weight of his own selfish desires. In the guest room down the hall, Marilyn sat on the edge of the bed they'd bought for visitors who never came, Sydney had been too busy building his career to maintain friendships and placed her hand on her stomach. For 2 weeks, she'd suspected. The signs were all there, written in the language her body had begun speaking in whispers and symptoms. Tomorrow, she would take the test. Tomorrow, she would know for certain that Sydney Potter had abandoned not just her, but the children growing inside her, his children, his flesh and blood, his legacy that would grow up never knowing their father's name or face. Tonight, she would cry for the fairy tale that had died, and then she would begin building something real from its ashes. Through the walls, she could hear Sydney moving around their bedroom, packing his life into boxes as if their years together had been a temporary assignment, a job he'd completed and could now leave behind. She wondered if he would ever think of her again, or if she would simply become a footnote in his success story, the wife he'd outgrown on his way to greater things. The rain continued its relentless percussion against the windows, each drop a reminder that some storms were necessary to wash away what was dead so new life could grow. Marilyn pressed her palm flat against her belly, feeling the first stirrings of maternal instinct, fierce and protective and already more powerful than any love she'd ever felt for a man. Even in her heartbreak, even with tears streaming down her face and her world crumbling around her like a castle made of sand, Marilyn Dave made a promise to the tiny lives she carried. They would never know abandonment like this. They would grow up surrounded by love so fierce, so unwavering, that Sydney Potter's absence would be irrelevant. They would be her masterpiece, her triumph, her proof that love could conquer even the cruelest betrayal. At 3 a.m, Sydney Potter drove away from Georgetown in his BMW, leaving behind a wife who didn't know she was carrying his sons, and taking with him nothing but ambition and the hollow echo of a heart that had forgotten how to love anything more than success. The headlights cut through the darkness like accusations, illuminating the road ahead but leaving everything behind, shrouded in shadow. He never looked back, not even once, as he drove toward a future he thought would make him happy. Behind him, in a house that was no longer a home, Marilyn Dave placed both hands on her belly and whispered the first of 10,000 promises to the children he would never know he'd abandoned. The rain stopped just as dawn broke over Georgetown, as if the sky itself was ready to begin again. And in that small apartment bedroom, with tears drying on her cheeks and hope blooming in her heart despite everything, Marilyn Dave began the greatest love story of her life, not with a man who'd chosen to leave, but with the children who would choose every day to stay. To Chapter 2, Rising from Ashes. Sometimes God breaks your heart to show you what it looks like when it's perfectly whole. The pregnancy test trembled in Marilyn's hands as 2 pink lines appeared like tiny miracles in the bathroom of the small apartment she'd rented in Brooklyn Heights. 3 months had passed since Sydney walked out of their marriage and into his new life with Tiffany Blake, his 23-year-old secretary who looked at him like he'd hung the moon and never questioned his choices or challenged his dreams. Twins, Dr. Rose had told her just hours before, her gentle voice filled with wonder as she pointed to the ultrasound screen, where 2 perfect little beings flickered like stars in the dark universe of Marilyn's womb. 2 healthy babies about 14 weeks along. Congratulations, Mama. Twins. Marilyn sank onto her small couch, the pregnancy test still clutched in her fingers like evidence of a miracle she hadn't dared hope for. 2 babies. 2 perfect little souls who would never know their father because he'd chosen ambition over love, success over family, the temporary thrill of conquest over the permanent beauty of commitment. The apartment was tiny compared to the Georgetown townhouse. 1 bedroom with barely enough space for her belongings, let alone cribs and baby supplies and all the equipment that came with raising children. But it was hers, paid for with the small settlement Sydney's lawyer had provided, and more importantly, it was filled with love, where the townhouse had become an empty monument to a dead marriage. The next morning brought her first encounter with morning sickness, so severe she could barely lift her head from the bathroom floor. Alone, with no husband to hold her hair back or bring her ginger tea, Marilyn learned the first lesson of single motherhood. You found strength you never knew existed when little lives depended on you. By her second trimester, she'd started a small consulting business from her laptop, helping other women navigate divorce and rebuild their careers. The irony wasn't lost on her. Sydney's abandonment had given her the motivation to help other women survive similar betrayals. Each client she helped was another victory over the voice in her head that whispered she wasn't strong enough, smart enough, worthy enough to make it alone. It was at a networking event for female entrepreneurs, when she was 7 months pregnant and glowing with the kind of beauty that came from knowing you were creating life, that she first saw Manuel John across the crowded hotel ballroom. He stood apart from the other attendees, not because he was the only man in a room full of ambitious women, but because he possessed the kind of presence that drew every eye without demanding attention. Manuel was tall, with the broad shoulders and strong hands of someone who'd built things before he'd bought them, dark hair that caught light like silk, and brown eyes that seemed to see everything and judge nothing. At 35, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd earned his success rather than inherited it, who understood that real power came from lifting others up rather than stepping on them to climb higher. Their eyes met across the room, and Marilyn felt something she hadn't experienced since Sydney's betrayal, the electric recognition of a soul calling to its match. But she was 7 months pregnant, recently divorced, and in no position to complicate her life with romantic entanglements, no matter how gorgeous or intriguing they might be. Manuel crossed the room with the purposeful stride of someone who'd identified his objective and wouldn't be deterred. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying just the hint of an accent that spoke of European sophistication. "But you're Marilyn Dave, aren't you? I've been following your work with female entrepreneurs. I'm Manuel John." The name hit her like lightning. Manuel John, founder and CEO of John Industries, the tech empire that had revolutionized sustainable energy and made him one of the youngest billionaires in America. She'd read about him in Forbes, the self-made visionary who'd started with nothing and built something extraordinary, all while maintaining a reputation for treating employees like family and using his wealth to fund education initiatives for underprivileged children. "Mr. John," she managed, suddenly self-conscious about her pregnant belly straining against her dress. "I'm surprised you know my work. Please call me Manuel. And your reputation precedes you, the woman who helps other women rebuild their lives after devastating setbacks. That's exactly the kind of work I admire." His eyes dropped briefly to her belly, then returned to her face with no judgment, only warmth. "Congratulations on your pregnancy. You're glowing." The simple kindness in his voice, the way he looked at her pregnant form, as if it made her more beautiful rather than less desirable, brought tears to her eyes. Sydney had never looked at her pregnant body with anything but dismay, as if her changing shape was a personal inconvenience he'd have to endure. "Thank you," she whispered. "I have a proposition for you," Manuel continued, his business mind clearly working. "John Industries is launching a new division focused on supporting women-owned businesses. We need someone to head the initiative, someone who understands from personal experience what it takes to rebuild after loss. Would you consider consulting for us?" Marilyn stared at him, wondering if this was real or if pregnancy hormones had caused her to hallucinate the most beautiful job opportunity of her life. "You want to hire me? Now, like this?" She gestured to her obvious pregnancy. "I want to hire your brilliant mind and your passionate heart," Manuel said simply. "The pregnancy just proves you're capable of nurturing life while building a future. Exactly the qualities we need for this project." That night, Marilyn lay in her small bed, feeling the twins kicking against her ribs as if they approved of the direction their lives were taking. Manuel John's business card sat on her nightstand, but it was his kindness she couldn't stop thinking about, the way he'd looked at her, as if her pregnancy made her magnificent rather than inconvenient. The respect in his voice when he'd spoken about her work. The immediate sense that here was a man who understood that strength and vulnerability could coexist beautifully. 3 weeks later, she started working for John Industries, operating from a stunning office in Manhattan that Manuel had equipped with everything a pregnant woman could need. Ergonomic furniture, a small kitchen stocked with healthy snacks, even a nap room for when the exhaustion became overwhelming. More importantly, he'd structured her position so she could work from home after the babies arrived, building a career around motherhood rather than despite it. The twins, Scott and Brian, arrived on a snowy February morning, perfect and healthy and absolutely worth every moment of pain and fear that had brought them into the world. Manuel sent flowers, not the standard congratulatory arrangement, but 2 small rose bushes, one for each boy, with a note that read, "For Scott and Brian, who are lucky to have the strongest woman I know as their mother. May these roses grow as beautifully as they will under your love." It was the first sign that Manuel John saw her children not as obstacles to their working relationship, but as blessings to be celebrated. For the first year of the twins' lives, Manuel was the perfect boss, supportive, understanding, never making her feel guilty when she had to leave early for doctor's appointments, or bring the babies to the office when childcare fell through. He sent thoughtful gifts on their birthdays, always remembered important milestones, and slowly, carefully, became more than just an employer. When Scott took his first steps across Manuel's office floor during a meeting when the boys were 11 months old, Manuel's face lit up with genuine joy. When Brian spoke his first word, "Mama," during a conference call, Manuel muted the line so everyone could hear and celebrate. He became Uncle Manuel to the boys, the honorary family member who showed up for important moments because he chose to, not because he had to. It was when the twins turned 2 that Marilyn realized she'd fallen in love with Manuel John, not because he was wealthy or powerful or devastatingly handsome, though he was all of those things. She loved him because he'd looked at her shattered life and seen beauty in the pieces, because he'd embraced her children as naturally as breathing, because he made her believe that happy endings were possible even after devastating beginnings. The realization hit her during Scott and Brian's second birthday party, held in Manuel's private garden, because her apartment was too small for all the family friends they'd accumulated. Watching him help Brian blow out his candles while Scott sat on his shoulders, seeing the way her sons looked at him with complete trust and adoration, Marilyn understood that this man had become their family without any of them officially acknowledging it. "Mama," Scott had said that night as she tucked him into his crib, "is Manuel our daddy?" The innocent question had stopped her heart. "What do you think, sweetheart?" "I think daddies are people who love mamas and babies and help with scary things and read bedtime stories," Scott had said with the profound logic of a 2-year-old. "Manuel does all those things." That night, after the boys were asleep, Marilyn sat in her small living room, staring at a photo from the party. Manuel laughing as both boys climbed on him like a human jungle gym, his face radiant with the kind of joy that only came from genuine love. She realized that somewhere between his first kind words and this moment, he'd become the answer to prayers she'd been afraid to pray. When Manuel knocked on her door at 10 p.m. with take-out Chinese food and a bottle of wine, she wasn't surprised. They'd fallen into the habit of ending important days together, talking through challenges and celebrating victories like the partners they'd become in all but name. "Good party today?" he said, settling on her couch with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged there. The boys seemed happy. They were. "They are." Marilyn curled up beside him, close enough to smell his cologne and feel the warmth radiating from his strong body. "Manuel, can I ask you something?" "Anything. Why do you do all this? The job, the support, the birthday parties, the way you treat Scott and Brian like they're—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Like they're mine." Manuel set down his wineglass and turned to face her fully. Because in every way that matters they are. I don't need DNA to love those boys, Marilyn. I just need to watch them grow and learn and become the magnificent men they're going to be. And I don't need a ring on your finger to know that I want to spend the rest of my life making you as happy as you've made me. The confession hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Marilyn looked into his eyes and saw her future, not the desperate grasping at happiness she'd experienced with Sydney, but the deep, abiding certainty of a love built on respect, partnership, and the shared commitment to nurture something beautiful together. "I love you," she whispered, the words feeling like coming home after a long, difficult journey. "I love you too," Manuel replied, reaching up to cup her face with hands that trembled slightly with emotion. "I love your strength, your beauty, your incredible heart. I love watching you be a mother. I love the way you've turned your pain into power and your loss into love. I love Scott and Brian like they're my own sons because loving you means loving everything that matters to you." When he kissed her, it was with the reverence of a man who understood that he was holding something precious, something that had been broken before and deserved to be treasured. It was nothing like the desperate passion she'd shared with Sydney. This was deeper, richer, a promise wrapped in tenderness and sealed with the kind of love that lasted lifetimes. That night, as Manuel held her in her small bed, with the twins sleeping peacefully in the next room, Marilyn understood that sometimes the worst thing that happened to you cleared the path for the best thing. Sydney's abandonment had been devastating, but it had also been necessary, because it had led her here, to this man, to this love, to this family that chose each other every single day. The twins woke them at dawn, climbing into bed between them with sleepy giggles and sticky fingers, and Manuel's first instinct was to pull them closer, to include them in the warmth and safety of his embrace. As Scott and Brian settled against his chest with the trust of children who'd never known abandonment, Marilyn realized that this was what love looked like, not the desperate neediness of her marriage to Sydney, but the quiet strength of people who chose to build something beautiful together. Manuel John had found her when she was broken and helped her become whole. Now 3 years into their love story, she couldn't imagine life without him. And the best part was that neither could Scott and Brian, who had never known a father's love, but had found something even better in a man who chose to love them, not because he had to, but because they were worth loving. But their fairy tale was just beginning, and the greatest test of their love was yet to come. Chapter 3. The Unexpected. Invitation. Fate has impeccable timing and a twisted sense of justice. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in late spring, delivered by courier to the penthouse offices of John Industries, where Marilyn now served as vice president of women's initiatives. The cream-colored envelope sat on her mahogany desk like an unexploded bomb, her name written in elegant calligraphy that transported her instantly back to a life she'd almost forgotten. Mrs. Marilyn Dave, not Dave John, as she'd been known for the past 2 years since her wedding to Manuel. Just Dave, as if the most beautiful chapter of her life had never been written. Janet Rodriguez, her assistant and closest friend, had brought the envelope with the kind of expression usually reserved for delivering terminal diagnoses. "It came by private courier," Janet said carefully, her usually warm voice tight with concern. "The messenger said it was important that you receive it personally." Marilyn stared at the envelope, her heart racing with the familiar rhythm of anxiety and dread. She knew that handwriting had once treasured love letters written in that same careful script. Only 2 people in the world still called her by her maiden name, her elderly aunt in Detroit, and the man who'd abandoned her 10 years ago. "Should I?" Janet began, reaching for the envelope as if to dispose of it. "No," Marilyn said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. "Close the door, please." When she was alone, Marilyn held the envelope up to the light, streaming through her floor-to-ceiling windows. 42 floors below, Manhattan bustled with the energy of 8 million people building their lives, while she sat frozen in time, holding what felt like a ghost from her past. With surgeon's steady hands, she opened the envelope. The invitation itself was a masterpiece of expensive taste, thick cardstock with gold embossing that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Everything about it screamed wealth, status, the kind of life Sydney had always craved more than love. Mr. Sidney Potter requests the honor of your presence at his wedding to Ms. Tiffany Blake. Saturday, June 15th at the Meridian Club. Reception to follow. Black tie required. There was a handwritten note on expensive letterhead. Marilyn, I thought you'd want to see how everything worked out. It would mean a lot to have you there. Hope life has been kind to you, Sydney. The casual cruelty of it stole her breath. After 10 years of silence, after walking away without a backward glance, he was inviting her to watch him marry another woman. The subtext was clear. Look how much better I did without you. Look how right I was to leave. Marilyn set the invitation down with infinite care, though her instinct was to tear it into pieces. Through her windows, she could see Central Park spreading green and gold beneath the June sunshine, a view that Manuel had specifically chosen for her office because he knew how much she loved watching the seasons change over the city they'd conquered together. Her phone buzzed with a text from Manuel. Lunch with my favorite woman. I have news that's going to make you smile. The simple message grounded her. Manuel John was everything Sydney Potter had never been. Present, devoted, a man who saw her strength as magnificent rather than threatening. Where Sydney had made her feel like she was too much, Manuel made her feel like she was exactly enough. Before she could respond, another text came through. The boys want to know if you'll be home for dinner. Scott's making his famous mac and cheese, and Brian's prepared a presentation about why we should get a dog. Her boys, now 10 years old, brilliant and confident, and completely secure in the knowledge that they were cherished beyond measure. They called Manuel Dad, and had never once asked about the man whose DNA they shared. In their world, fathers were men who showed up, who stayed, who chose love over everything else. So why was she considering responding to Sydney's invitation? Marilyn leaned back in her leather chair, studying the invitation with the same intensity she brought to complex business negotiations. Perhaps it was time for closure. Perhaps seeing Sydney married to another woman, settled into the life he'd chosen over her, would finally put to rest the small, wounded part of her heart that had never quite understood why she hadn't been enough. Or perhaps, and this thought came with a smile that was equal parts beautiful and terrible, it was time for Sydney Potter to learn what he had thrown away. She picked up her phone and called the one person who would understand the complexity of her emotions. Manuel answered on the first ring, as he always did when she called. Beautiful, his voice carried the warmth that could melt glaciers, the unconditional love that had taught her what marriage was supposed to feel like. Please tell me you're calling to say yes to lunch. Manuel, she said, her voice steady despite the storm in her chest. I need to talk to you about something important. There was a pause. Manuel had survived in the business world by reading between lines, and he heard everything she wasn't saying. Where are you? I'm coming up. 5 minutes later, Manuel walked into her office with the purposeful stride that had first caught her attention 7 years ago. At 45 now, he was even more handsome than when they'd met. Success and happiness had given him a confidence that made other men look diminished by comparison. He wore his wealth like a well-tailored suit, comfortable and understated, and his dark eyes immediately zeroed in on the invitation lying on her desk. What's this? He asked, though his tone suggested he already knew it was trouble. Sydney Potter is getting married, Marilyn said simply. He invited me to the wedding. Manuel picked up the invitation, reading it with the careful attention he brought to billion-dollar contracts. When he looked up, his expression was unreadable, not angry or jealous, but thoughtful in the way that had made him one of the most successful men in America. How do you feel about this? he asked, settling into the chair across from her desk. Confused, angry, curious, Marilyn stood and moved to the windows, looking out at the city where she'd rebuilt her life from ashes. I haven't thought about Sidney Potter in years. Not really. But seeing his name again, holding an invitation to his wedding, makes you wonder what might have been different, Manuel finished gently. No, Marilyn turned to face her husband. The man who'd loved her back to wholeness. It makes me wonder why he's reaching out now, after 10 years of silence. What does he want? Manuel studied her with the intensity that had made him billions, not by missing details others overlooked, but by understanding the human motivations behind every decision. Maybe he wants to see if you're still broken. Maybe he needs to know that leaving you was the right choice. And maybe, Marilyn said, moving to stand behind her desk like a general preparing for battle, it's time he learned what his choice actually cost him. The words hung between them like a declaration of war. Manuel leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and gave her the look that had first made her fall in love with him, not because he was handsome or wealthy, but because he saw her completely and loved what he saw. What are you thinking, mi amor? The Spanish endearment, which he only used when they were alone, sent warmth through her chest. I'm thinking our sons are 10 years old, brilliant and beautiful and completely loved. I'm thinking they've never met their biological father. I'm thinking Sidney Potter has no idea what he walked away from. And you want to show him. I want to close this chapter of our lives forever, Marilyn corrected. The boys are curious about their genetics. They've asked questions. Maybe it's time they got answers. Manuel was quiet for a long moment, and Marilyn could practically see his brilliant mind working through scenarios and implications. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of protective strength that had made her feel safe for the first time since Sidney's abandonment. If we do this, we do it together. As a family, I won't have you facing him alone. You'd come with me? To my ex-husband's wedding? Marilyn! Manuel stood and moved around the desk to take her hands in his. You are the love of my life. Scott and Brian are my sons in every way that matters. If you need to close this chapter, then we'll close it together. But I want you to be very sure about this. Some doors, once opened, can't be closed again. Marilyn looked into the eyes of the man who'd chosen to love her when she was broken, who'd embraced her children as his own, who'd built a life with her that was more beautiful than any fairy tale she'd ever imagined. I'm sure. I want the boys to meet him. I want them to see the difference between a man who abandoned them and a man who chose them. I want Sidney Potter to understand exactly what he gave up when he walked away from us. Then we'll go, Manuel said simply. But we'll go as the family we are, united, unshakable, and absolutely certain of our worth. That evening, they sat the twins down in their penthouse living room, the same space where Manuel had proposed 3 years earlier, where they'd celebrated every important milestone of their unconventional but perfect family. Boys, Marilyn began, her voice carrying the careful tone she used for important conversations. We need to talk about your biological father. Scott and Brian, now 10 and wise beyond their years, exchanged one of their wordless twin communications before giving their parents their full attention. They were beautiful children, Scott with his artistic soul and gentle heart, Brian with his mathematical mind and fierce loyalty, both carrying the confidence that came from being genuinely cherished. The sperm donor? Brian asked with the brutal directness that still caught adults off guard. Brian, Scott hissed, though he was clearly thinking the same thing. His name is Sidney Potter, Marilyn continued, fighting a smile at Janet's influence on their vocabulary. And he's getting married next month. He invited me to the wedding. That's weird, Scott observed with his artist's eye for emotional nuance. Why would he invite you? Does he want you back? I think he wants to show me how successful he's become, Marilyn said honestly. But more importantly, this might be an opportunity for you to meet him, if you want to. The twins considered this with the serious concentration they brought to complex problems. Finally, Brian spoke for both of them. We're curious. I mean, we know who our real dad is. He nodded toward Manuel. who was trying not to look emotional, but it might be interesting to meet the person whose genetics we inherited. Like a science experiment, Scott added helpfully. Nature versus nurture in real time. Manuel laughed despite himself. Your sons have no respect for emotional complexity. They get that from me, Marilyn said, smiling at her husband with the easy affection that still made Sydney's absence feel like the gift it had turned out to be. 3 weeks later, as they prepared for Sydney Potter's wedding, Marilyn stood in their walk-in closet, choosing her outfit with strategic precision, not out of vanity, but out of a desire to look like exactly what she was, a woman who had turned abandonment into triumph, rejection into resurrection. She chose a midnight blue dress that Manuel had bought her for their anniversary, silk that moved like water around her body, elegant without being showy, sophisticated in a way that whispered wealth rather than shouted it. The sapphire necklace he'd given her when Scott and Brian started calling him Dad would complete the ensemble. Manuel appeared behind her in the mirror, already dressed in his tuxedo, looking like he'd stepped from the pages of a magazine dedicated to men who conquered worlds and won hearts. You look magnificent, he said, his hands settling on her waist. I look like a woman who's exactly where she belongs, Marilyn corrected, leaning back against his chest. Which is magnificent, Manuel murmured against her ear. Are you ready for this? Marilyn looked at their reflection, a couple who'd built something beautiful from broken pieces, who'd turned pain into power and loss into love. I'm ready to show Sydney Potter what he could have had if he'd chosen love over ambition. And if he'd been worthy of it, Manuel added, pressing a kiss to her temple. The twins appeared in their doorway, handsome in their miniature tuxedos, looking like young princes who'd never doubted their place in the world. Are we really going to crash a wedding? Scott asked, with barely contained excitement. We're not crashing anything, Marilyn said firmly. We were invited. We're simply accepting the invitation as the family we are. This is going to be epic, Brian announced with satisfaction. As their car pulled up to the Meridian Club 3 hours later, Marilyn took Manuel's hand and squeezed it gently. Thank you, she said quietly, for coming with me, for being exactly what Sydney never was. Thank you, Manuel replied, for letting me love you, for giving me the family I never knew I wanted, for being brave enough to build something beautiful from something broken. The Meridian Club rose before them like a monument to old money and older traditions, its Georgian columns gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. But Marilyn felt no intimidation, no insecurity about her place in this rarefied world. She was Mrs. Manuel John now, mother to 2 brilliant boys, partner to a man who'd built an empire and chosen her to share it with. She was about to give Sydney Potter the education of his lifetime, and she was going to enjoy every minute of it. Chapter 4. Preparing the Perfect Storm. The most powerful weapon is not anger, but the undeniable evidence of a life well lived. In the 3 weeks leading up to Sydney Potter's wedding, the John family home became a study in controlled preparation. Their penthouse overlooked Central Park from the 68th floor, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view that made Manhattan look like a kingdom spread below their feet. But it wasn't the wealth or the luxury that made it beautiful. It was the love that filled every room, the laughter that echoed from the boys' bedrooms, the way Manuel looked at Marilyn as if she'd hung the stars in the sky just for him. Tell us again why we're going to this wedding, Scott said one evening as they sat around their dining table, the city lights twinkling like earthbound stars beyond the windows. He was working on architectural sketches for a treehouse he wanted to build in the small garden Manuel had created on their private terrace. Because sometimes you have to close old chapters before you can fully appreciate the new ones, Marilyn explained. watching her older son's artistic hands move across the paper with the same precision he'd inherited from her, and the creativity that was purely his own. Plus, Brian added, without looking up from his laptop where he was calculating the compound interest on their college funds, Janet says the sperm donor needs to see what he missed out on. She used much more colorful language, but Mom made me promise not to repeat it. Manuel choked on his wine. Janet's invested in this family's happiness. Janet thinks Sydney Potter is a... Brian began. Brian, Marilyn warned, though she was fighting a smile. Foolish man who made poor life choices. He finished innocently. The truth was, everyone in their world was invested in this story. Manuel's parents had flown in from Barcelona the week before, ostensibly for their grandson's upcoming birthday, but really to meet the woman who'd captured their son's heart so completely. His mother, Eleanor, was a force of nature who'd taken one look at Marilyn and declared her perfect. Finally, a woman strong enough for my stubborn son. Mija, Elena had said over dinner the night before, using the Spanish term of endearment that made Marilyn's heart warm every time. This man who left you, he's going to take one look at what you've built and realize. He threw away a diamond to pick up broken glass. Mama, Emmanuel had warned, though he was smiling. What? It's true. Look at this family. 2 brilliant boys, a son who finally learned how to love properly, a daughter-in-law who makes him happy. This Sydney will see all of this and know he's a fool. Manuel's father, Carlos, had been quieter, but no less supportive. In business, he told Marilyn as they walked through Central Park with the twins, the biggest mistakes aren't the bad investments you make. They're the good ones you walk away from. This man walked away from the best investment of his life. Even the boys' school had gotten involved when their teacher, Mrs. Henderson, heard they were meeting their biological father. I hope he understands what remarkable young men he's meeting, she'd said during their parent-teacher conference. Scott and Brian are extraordinary, not just intellectually but emotionally. They're kind, confident and secure in ways that only come from being genuinely loved. As the wedding date approached, Marilyn found herself paying attention to details that had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with authenticity. This wasn't about proving anything to Sydney. It was about showing her sons what real love looked like, what a real family was capable of building together. The night before the wedding, Manuel found her standing in their bedroom, holding a framed photo from their own wedding 3 years earlier. In the picture, Scott and Brian stood beside them at the altar, beaming as they watched their mother marry the man who'd chosen to be their father. The joy on their faces was incandescent. Children who'd never doubted they were wanted, cherished, absolutely secure in their place in the world. Second thoughts? Manuel asked gently, settling behind her on their bed. Never, Marilyn said firmly, turning to face the man who'd taught her what love was supposed to feel like. I'm thinking about how different this photo is from my first wedding. She walked to their closet and retrieved another frame from the back of a drawer, her wedding photo with Sydney. The difference was startling. Where her current family radiated joy and security, the old photo showed a young woman trying too hard to look happy, while a man looked like he was already planning his escape. You look beautiful in both, Emmanuel said diplomatically. I look desperate in that one, Marilyn corrected, setting Sydney's photo aside. I look like I was trying to convince myself I was happy. Look at my eyes. They're pleading with the camera to believe this was what I wanted. She picked up their family photo again, studying her own face. Here I look like I know exactly where I belong. Because I do. Manuel stood and crossed to her, taking the frame gently and setting it on their dresser. You belong here with us, building something beautiful with people who choose you every day. But tomorrow, if you need to show Sydney Potter what he lost, we'll show him. As a family. That night, Marilyn lay in Manuel's arms, listening to the sounds of their boys getting ready for bed in their rooms down the hall. Scott reading architecture books by flashlight under his covers. Brian probably calculating something on his tablet despite the no electronics rule. Normal, beautiful chaos that came from raising children who felt safe enough to push boundaries because they knew they were loved unconditionally. "Manuel," she whispered into the darkness, "Sí, mi amor. When you first saw me, pregnant and broken and trying to hold my life together, what made you want to help me?" Manuel was quiet for so long she thought he'd fallen asleep. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute truth. "I saw a woman who'd been knocked down but wasn't staying down. I saw someone who'd been betrayed but hadn't let it make her bitter. I saw a fighter, not angry or desperate but determined. And I thought, here's someone who knows how to love completely, who's learned how to be strong without becoming hard. I wanted to be worthy of that kind of love. And now I wake up every day grateful that you let me love you, that you trusted me with your heart after it had been broken, that you let me be Scott and Brian's father when I had no claim to them except the love I felt the moment I met them." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Tomorrow, Sydney Potter is going to see what I see every day, the most magnificent woman in the world, surrounded by a family that adores her. And he's going to realize he's spent 10 years living with the consequences of the stupidest decision anyone has ever made." The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, Manhattan spreading beneath their windows like a city made of dreams. The twins were up early, their excitement palpable as they prepared to meet the man whose genetics they carried, but who was a complete stranger to their hearts. "Do you think he'll recognize us?" Scott asked as Manuel helped him with his bow tie. "You both look exactly like I did at your age," Manuel said, which was true. The boys had inherited Sydney's bone structure and coloring, but carried themselves with the confidence that came from being raised by a man who believed in them absolutely. "He'll know you're his sons the moment he sees you, but will he want to be our dad?" Brian asked with the directness that sometimes broke his parents' hearts. Manuel knelt down to his younger son's level, taking his small hands in his own. "Brian, listen to me. You already have a dad, me. Not because of genetics or biology, but because I choose to love you every single day. This man we're meeting today, he might be your biological father, but he's not your dad. I am nothing and no one can change that. Promise?" Brian whispered. "Promise," Manuel said firmly. "You're my boys. Forever." An hour later, they stood in the foyer of their home, the John family dressed like royalty, preparing for a state function. Marilyn in her midnight blue dress with Manuel's sapphires at her throat, Manuel in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, and Scott and Brian looking like young princes who'd never doubted their place in the world. "Everyone ready?" Marilyn asked, though she could see in their faces that they were. "Ready?" the twins said in unison. "Ready," Manuel confirmed, offering his wife his arm. As their car pulled away from their building, heading toward the Meridian Club, where Sydney Potter was about to get the education of his lifetime, Marilyn felt a strange sense of completion. This wasn't about revenge, it was about closure. It was about showing her sons the difference between a man who walked away and a man who stayed. It was about proving to herself, once and for all, that Sydney's abandonment had been his loss, not hers. Most importantly, it was about celebrating the family they'd built from the ashes of his betrayal, a family so strong, so full of love, so absolutely unshakable that even the ghost of her past couldn't diminish its beauty. Sydney Potter had invited her to his wedding to show her what she'd missed. Instead, she was about to show him what he'd thrown away, and it was going to be magnificent. Chapter 5. The Grand Entrance. Sometimes destiny arrives wearing designer clothes and carrying the truth in the voices of children. The Meridian Club stood like a temple to old money and older traditions, its Georgian columns rising from manicured lawns that had hosted the celebrations of America's elite for over 2 centuries. On this perfect June afternoon, every detail gleamed with the polish that only unlimited wealth could provide. crystal chandeliers throwing rainbows across marble floors, arrangements of white roses that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and 300 guests dressed in the kind of formal attire that whispered rather than shouted status. In the bridal suite, Sidney Potter stood before a full-length mirror, adjusting his platinum cufflinks for the third time in 5 minutes. At 38, he was handsome in the way that money and good genetics made possible, perfectly groomed, expensively dressed, carrying himself with the confidence that came from finally achieving everything he'd thought he wanted. His reflection showed a successful man about to marry a beautiful woman in front of everyone who mattered in New York's financial and social circles. So why did he feel hollow inside? "You look perfect, darling," Tiffany Blake said, appearing behind him in her wedding dress, a confection of silk and diamonds that had cost more than most people's cars and made her look like a fairy tale princess. At 28, she was beautiful in the calculated way of women who'd learned to use their looks as currency, blonde and blue-eyed, and young enough to make Sidney feel powerful and desired. "Do I?" Sidney studied his reflection, searching for the satisfaction he'd expected to feel on his wedding day. Instead, he felt like an actor playing a role he'd never quite learned properly. "Of course you do. You're marrying me, aren't you?" Tiffany laughed, the sound bright and brittle. "And in front of all these important people. Charles Blackwood is here, and Senator Whitfield, and the Mortons from Boston. Even Alexander Cross sent his regrets. Apparently he's at some family function with his wife." Sidney nodded. Though something about the mention of Alexander Cross, the billionaire whose empire made Sidney's success look modest by comparison, sent a chill down his spine. He'd sent invitations to everyone who mattered in their social circle, including some he barely knew, as a way of announcing his arrival in their rarefied world, including one invitation he'd sent on impulse to a woman he hadn't spoken to in 10 years but couldn't quite forget. "Has anyone heard from Marilyn Dave?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Tiffany's smile faltered slightly. "Your first wife? Why would you care if she comes to our wedding?" "I don't care. I thought it would be nice closure for both of us." It was a lie, and they both knew it. The truth was more complicated. Sidney had sent that invitation partly out of curiosity, partly out of a need to prove to himself that leaving her had been the right choice, and partly out of a cruel desire to show her how much better he'd done without her. "Well, I suppose we'll find out," Tiffany said, though her tone suggested she hoped Marilyn Dave had been too intimidated to show up. Outside, guests were already arriving for the ceremony, a parade of New York's financial and social elite flowing across the club's front lawn like a river of designer gowns and perfectly tailored tuxedos. Sidney watched from his window as senators and CEOs, old money and new, gathered to witness his marriage to Tiffany and confirm his arrival in their world. In the main reception hall, conversation buzzed with the kind of speculation that only came when very wealthy people gathered to observe each other's life choices. Charles Blackwood, whose family had owned half of Manhattan since the Dutch settled it, stood near the bar discussing Sidney's meteoric rise with Senator Patricia Whitfield. "Impressive trajectory," Blackwood mused, sipping champagne that cost more per bottle than most people earned in a month. From middle-class nothing to this level of wealth in 15 years. Though I have to say I'm curious about his first wife. "Marilyn Dave," the senator nodded. "I heard she did quite well for herself after the divorce. Runs some kind of consulting firm, I believe." "More than that," said Margaret Morton, the Boston socialite whose family trust managed billions. "I heard she married into serious money. The Cross family, if rumors are true." The name sent a ripple of interest through their small group. The Cross family wasn't just wealthy, they were wealthy in the way that transcended normal categories, the kind of money that shaped economies rather than simply participating in them. "Alexander Cross?" Blackwood's eyebrows rose. "Are you certain?"
That's what I heard.
And if it's true, then Potter's first wife went from middle management to the absolute pinnacle of American society. Makes one wonder what kind of woman she must be to capture Alexander Cross's attention. Their speculation was interrupted by a subtle shift in the room's energy, the kind of change that occurred when someone truly important arrived. Conversations didn't stop, but they quieted, and heads began turning toward the entrance, like flowers following the sun. And then the Cross family walked in. Marilyn moved through the crowd like she owned not just the room, but the building, the city, possibly the entire eastern seaboard. She wore midnight blue silk that moved like water around her curves, sapphires at her throat that caught the light and threw it back in brilliant flashes. Her dark hair swept into an elegant chignon that showcased her natural beauty. At 35, she had matured. From the pretty girl Sydney had married into a woman who commanded attention simply by existing, but it was the man beside her who made the room fall silent. Alexander Cross moved with the quiet confidence of someone who'd built empires before most people finished college. Tall and distinguished, with silver threading through his dark hair that only made him more handsome. He wore his wealth like a perfectly tailored suit, comfortable, understated, devastating in its understatement. Together, he and Marilyn looked like they'd stepped from the pages of a magazine dedicated to people who ruled the world, but it was the children who stopped traffic entirely. Two boys flanked the couple like young princes, protecting their kingdom, identical in their perfection, and carrying themselves with the kind of natural aristocracy that couldn't be bought or learned. At 10 years old, they were already tall for their age, their mixed heritage giving them an exotic beauty that made every eye in the room follow their progress. And they looked exactly like Sidney Potter. Not approximately like him, not sort of resembling him. They looked like someone had taken his childhood photographs, split them into two living, breathing children, and raised them in a world where confidence came as naturally as breathing. "Jesus Christ," Charles Blackwood whispered, his champagne glass frozen halfway to his lips. "Are those Potters?" "Children," Senator Whitfield finished, her voice carrying the kind of shocked recognition that came from seeing something impossible made manifest. "They have to be. The resemblance is undeniable," Margaret Morton breathed. Around the room, 300 of New York's most sophisticated people collectively realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Not just the arrival of wedding guests, but the entrance of a family so magnificent, so obviously successful and happy, that their presence transformed everyone else into supporting players in their story. Near the altar, Sidney Potter felt his legs go weak as he watched the impossible become reality. Those boys, his boys, because there was no denying the genetic connection, moved through the crowd with the confidence of children who'd never doubted they belonged wherever they chose to be. They wore their expensive clothes like they'd been born to them, spoke to adults with the easy courtesy of those raised in privilege, and looked at the world like it was theirs to inherit, which, given their stepfather's net worth, it essentially was. Tiffany's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Who are those children?" "They look like me," Sidney finished, his voice barely above a whisper. "They look like me." But that wasn't quite right. He realized as he watched them move through the crowd, charming every adult they encountered with the effortless grace that came from being genuinely loved and supported. They looked like him, but they carried themselves like Alexander Cross, with the quiet authority of those who'd never had to prove their worth because it had never been questioned. The family approached the altar area with the kind of purposeful progress that suggested they weren't just attending this wedding. They were the reason for it. Marilyn looked up at Sidney with eyes that held no anger, no pain, no residue of the heartbreak he'd left in his wake 10 years ago. Instead, she looked at him with something far more devastating than hatred, polite recognition, the kind reserved for distant acquaintances whose names you struggled to remember. "Hello, Sidney," she said, her voice carrying easily through the suddenly hushed room. "Congratulations on your wedding. You look well." The casual grace of it, treating him like a former colleague rather than the man who'd destroyed her life, was more humbling than any accusation could have been. This wasn't the desperate, heartbroken girl he'd abandoned. This was a queen acknowledging a minor courtier, and everyone in the room recognized the power dynamic instantly. "Marilyn," he managed, his voice cracking like a teenager's. You came." "Of course." Her smile was picture-perfect, revealing nothing while somehow conveying everything. "How could I miss such a celebration?" Alexander stepped forward, extending his hand with the kind of easy confidence that came from never having to prove anything to anyone. "Alexander Cross," he said simply. "Congratulations on your marriage." The name hung in the air like an executioner's blade. Sidney shook the offered hand with numb fingers, feeling like he was greeting his own funeral director while 300 witnesses watched his humiliation unfold in real time. But it was the boys who delivered the killing blow. The older one, Scott, though Sidney had no way of knowing that, stepped forward with the kind of natural politeness that marked him as genuinely well-raised. "Hello, sir," he said, his voice carrying the slight formality of a child addressing an adult he didn't know well. "I'm Scott Davecross." His brother moved beside him with identical grace. "And I'm Brian Davecross. We believe you might be our biological father." The words dropped into the silence like artillery shells. Around the room, 300 of the most sophisticated people in America collectively inhaled, realizing they were witnessing the social scandal of the decade unfold in real time. Sidney stared down at them. These impossible children who carried his features but not his name, who moved with confidence he'd never possessed even now. They looked up at him with curious, intelligent eyes, not seeking approval or love or acknowledgement, but simply observing the man whose genes they carried like detached scientists studying an interesting specimen. Sidney's voice failed him entirely. He looked from the boys to Marilyn, seeing now what he'd been too shocked to notice before. She wasn't showing him these children to hurt him or claim anything from him. She was simply allowing them to satisfy their natural curiosity about their origins. And in doing so, she was destroying him more completely than any weapon could have. These weren't just his sons, they were tiny titans, miniature masters of the universe who spoke with the casual authority of children raised in a world where anything was possible. They were everything he might have been if he'd been raised with love instead of ambition, security instead of desperation, confidence instead of the constant need to prove himself worthy. Behind them stood the man who'd been their real father, not the one who'd contributed DNA, but the one who'd shown up, who'd stayed, who'd chosen them and their mother when Sidney had chosen to run away. As the wedding guests watched in fascinated horror, Sidney Potter realized he was looking at the greatest revenge imaginable, not his destruction, but the magnificent life his family had built without him. They didn't need him, hadn't missed him, hadn't even thought about him. They'd simply taken his abandonment and transformed it into the foundation for something beautiful. The revenge was so perfect, so complete, so utterly devastating that Sidney could only stand at his own wedding altar and watch his past demolish his future with the innocent voices of the sons he'd thrown away before they were even born. And the most devastating part was that they weren't trying to hurt him. They were simply being themselves, brilliant, confident, loved children who'd grown up without him and turned out perfect anyway. Chapter 6. Recognition and Shock. The truth has a way of arriving at the worst possible moment, dressed in its finest clothes and speaking in the voices of children. The silence that followed Brian's matter-of-fact announcement, "We believe you might be our biological father," stretched like a taut wire about to snap. 300 of New York's most powerful people held their collective breath, watching Sidney Potter's carefully constructed world implode with the slow-motion fascination usually reserved for natural disasters and social catastrophes. Tiffany Blake, resplendent in her $50,000 wedding dress, moved closer to Sydney with the instinctive need for protection that came from recognizing a threat she didn't fully understand. Her blue eyes darted between her groom and the family that had materialized like beautiful ghosts from his past. Her perfect wedding day dissolving into something that would be remembered for all the wrong reasons. "Sydney," she whispered, her voice carrying the high pitch of barely contained panic. "What is he talking about? You don't have children. You told me you didn't have children." But Sydney couldn't answer her, couldn't even acknowledge her presence, because he was staring at these impossible boys with the kind of recognition that went deeper than resemblance. It was like looking at home movies of his own childhood. If those movies had been directed by someone who understood that children should be confident rather than anxious, loved rather than tolerated, celebrated rather than endured. Scott tilted his head with the curiosity that had driven him to excel in everything from mathematics to art. "We didn't mean to upset anyone," he said politely, his voice carrying the genuine concern of a child who'd never learned to be cruel. "We were just curious about genetics and family medical history. And probability theory," Brian added helpfully, his mathematical mind already calculating the social dynamics unfolding around them. "The statistical likelihood of our physical resemblance being coincidental is approximately 0.0003%, accounting for ethnic and regional population genetics." A nervous laugh rippled through the crowd. These weren't just Sydney's abandoned children, they were tiny geniuses who spoke with the casual authority of children raised in a world where intellectual achievement was expected and celebrated. "You're 10, Sydney asked, his voice barely audible as his mind raced through the implications. 10 years old meant Marilyn had been pregnant when he left her. Pregnant, and she'd never told him. Pregnant, and he'd walked away from his unborn children without ever knowing they existed. "Yes, sir," Scott confirmed. "We'll be 11 in February. We're twins, obviously, though Brian's technically younger by 17 minutes, which he never lets me forget. It's statistically relevant." Brian protested with the kind of sibling banter that spoke of deep affection, despite surface friction. Birth order affects personality development and achievement patterns. Around them, the wedding guests watched this surreal family conversation unfold with the horrified fascination of people witnessing something they'd never imagined possible. Charles Blackwood leaned toward his wife, whispering, "Those boys are remarkable. Look at them, completely at ease, genuinely polite, no anger or resentment. It's almost biblical." Senator Whitfield nodded grimly. "They're not here seeking acknowledgement or love. They have all of that at home. They're simply satisfying their intellectual curiosity about their origins." She was right. Scott and Brian stood with the kind of natural dignity that came from being genuinely secure in their place in the world. They weren't here as supplicants hoping for their father's approval. They were here as confident young men graciously meeting a stranger who happened to share their DNA. "Mr. Potter," Scott continued, with the formal politeness that had been drilled into him since childhood, "may I ask why you didn't stay in touch with our mother? Did something happen between you?" The question, asked with the genuine innocence of a child seeking information, hit Sydney like a physical blow. How could he explain to these perfect boys that he'd abandoned their mother not because of anything she'd done wrong, but because he'd been too selfish, too ambitious, too fundamentally broken to recognize the treasure he'd been given? "Is complicated," Sydney managed, which was both true and completely inadequate. "How complicated could it be?" Brian asked with the mathematical precision that made him terrifying in any discussion. "You were married, then you weren't. You left, she stayed. The variables seem straightforward." Manuel watched this destruction with the clinical fascination of someone who'd witnessed many hostile takeovers, but never one conducted by children armed with nothing but honesty and intellectual curiosity. Beside him, Marilyn remained perfectly composed. neither defending nor attacking Sydney, simply allowing the truth to speak for itself through the voices of their sons. "I was young," Sydney said desperately, grasping for an explanation that wouldn't make him sound like the monster he was beginning to realize he'd been. "I thought I wanted different things." "What kind of different things?" Scott pressed with the relentless curiosity of a child who'd inherited his mother's analytical mind and his stepfather's refusal to accept non-answers. "Success, financial security, a chance to build something important," Sydney said, the words tumbling out before he could consider how they would sound to a room full of people who valued family above individual achievement. The admission hung in the air like poison gas. Around the room, faces that had looked at him with respect and envy now showed the kind of contempt reserved for men who abandoned their families for money and status. He'd just confessed to 300 witnesses that he'd left his pregnant wife because he'd wanted to be rich and important. The kind of moral failing that their social circle considered unforgivable. "But you could have built something important with Mom," Brian observed with devastating logic. "She's built lots of important things. She bought Morrison Industries last month for $22 million, cash." A ripple of impressed murmurs ran through the crowd. Morrison Industries was old New York royalty, and the casual mention of its acquisition, delivered by a 10-year-old who obviously considered it routine, drove home exactly how far out of Sydney's league his ex-wife had climbed. "She did?" Sydney whispered, feeling like Alice falling down a rabbit hole where nothing made sense anymore. "Oh, yes," Scott said brightly, completely unaware of the devastation his words were causing. "Mom's very successful. She has offices in 12 countries now, and Dad has offices in 18. We went to the Tokyo opening last Christmas. Have you ever been to Tokyo, Mr. Potter?" The question, innocent on its surface, was devastating in its implications. These children traveled the world, lived lives of genuine privilege and global significance, spoke multiple languages, and moved through international business circles like they owned them. Sydney's considerable success, which he'd been so proud to display at this wedding, suddenly looked provincial by comparison. "No," Sydney said quietly. "I haven't been to Tokyo." "You should go," Brian suggested helpfully, his tone carrying the unconscious authority of someone accustomed to having his suggestions taken seriously. "It's very educational. Though you'd need to learn some Japanese first. We speak 4 languages. 5 if you count financial planning, which Dad says is basically its own language." Tiffany was staring at the boys with the growing horror of someone realizing she'd been competing in the wrong race entirely. These weren't just Sydney's abandoned children. They were members of a global elite that made Sydney's success look like a child's lemonade stand. "How much money does your family have?" she blurted out, then immediately flushed red at her own rudeness. "I'm sorry, that was inappropriate." "It's okay," Scott said kindly, apparently genuinely unfazed by the question. "Dad says it's rude to discuss specific numbers, but Forbes estimated our family net worth at $2.7 billion last year, though that was before the Mumbai acquisition, so it's probably higher now." The number hit the wedding guests like a tsunami. Not million, billion. With a B, Sydney Potter's considerable wealth, which he'd spent years accumulating and had planned to display at this wedding like a trophy, suddenly looked like pocket change scattered on the floor of Fort Knox. "Billion," Tiffany whispered, her voice barely audible. "With a B," Brian confirmed helpfully, his mathematical mind naturally drawn to precision. "Though Dad always says money isn't the important thing. Love is the important thing. Money just makes it easier to take care of the people you love." The simple statement, delivered with the wisdom of a child who'd never had to choose between love and security, was the final nail in Sydney's coffin. Around the room, faces that had looked at him with respect and envy now showed open contempt and pity. He wasn't just a man who'd abandoned his family. He'd abandoned a family that had gone on to achieve everything he'd ever dreamed of and more. "You left them," Margaret Morton said, her voice carrying across the sudden silence with the authority of someone whose family had shaped American history for generations. "You left your pregnant wife and never looked back." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact that everyone in the room now understood, and the judgment in her voice was absolute. "I didn't know she was pregnant," Sydney said desperately, though the distinction meant nothing to anyone but him. "But you left anyway," Scott observed, with the kind of devastating clarity that came from a child who'd never learned to soften difficult truths. "Without checking if she needed anything, without making sure she was okay." It wasn't an accusation, it was simply a statement of fact, delivered by a 10-year-old who understood cause and effect better than most adults understood their own motivations. And it cut deeper than any adult condemnation could have, because it came from innocent clarity rather than emotional manipulation. Sydney looked at these boys, his boys, the sons he'd never known he'd abandoned, and saw not anger or hurt or longing, but simple assessment. They were measuring him not against their hopes or dreams, but against the man who'd actually raised them. And in that comparison, Sydney Potter came up catastrophically short. "Sydney," Tiffany said, her voice shaking with the kind of fear that came from watching your entire future crumble in real time. "We need to talk, privately, now." But there was nowhere private to go. The Meridian Club's wedding chapel was designed for public celebration, not private crisis management. Sydney was trapped on his own altar, watching his future bride realize that she'd agreed to marry down so far it was practically subterranean. Around them, 300 witnesses watched the drama unfold with the horrified fascination reserved for social catastrophes and public humiliations. This wasn't just a wedding anymore. It was the public execution of Sydney Potter's reputation, conducted by his own abandoned children with surgical precision. And the most devastating part was that they weren't trying to hurt him. They were simply being themselves, brilliant, confident, loved children who'd grown up without him and turned out magnificent anyway. They didn't need his approval or acknowledgement or love, because they had all of those things at home. They were simply satisfying their curiosity about the man whose genes they carried, the way they might study any other interesting but ultimately unimportant historical artifact. The revenge was so beautiful, so complete, so utterly crushing that Sydney Potter could only stand at his own wedding altar and watch his past demolish his future with the innocent voices of the sons he'd thrown away before they were even born. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered the truth he'd spent 10 years trying to avoid. This was exactly what he deserved. Chapter 7. The unraveling begins. A reputation takes decades to build and only moments to destroy, especially when the destroyers are 10 years old and telling the truth. The silence following Scott's devastating observation that Sydney had left without checking if his wife was okay, stretched like a chasm opening in the marble floor of the Meridian Club. 300 of New York's most influential people watched Sydney Potter's world collapse with the horrified fascination usually reserved for natural disasters, while his abandoned sons stood before him with the patient curiosity of children waiting for an adult to answer a simple question. Tiffany Blake, magnificent in her wedding dress but trembling with barely contained panic, looked between her groom and the family that had materialized to destroy everything she'd thought she was gaining by marrying him. The fairy tale wedding she'd planned for 2 years was becoming a public relations nightmare that would follow her for the rest of her life. "Sydney," she hissed, grabbing his arm with manicured fingers that dug in like claws, "explain this. Right now, make it make sense." But Sydney couldn't make it make sense, because there was no explanation that wouldn't reveal him to be exactly what he was. A man who'd abandoned his pregnant wife for the promise of success and spent 10 years congratulating himself on a choice that had been morally bankrupt from the beginning. "Tiffany, please," he whispered, though he didn't know what he was asking her to do. Forgive him? Pretend this wasn't happening? Continue with a wedding that had become a wake for his reputation? In the crowd, conversations had resumed in urgent whispers as New York's social elite processed what they'd just witnessed. Charles Blackwood stood with Senator Whitfield and Margaret Morton, their faces showing the kind of expression usually reserved for discussing someone's death. "This is unprecedented," Blackwood murmured, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd witnessed 50 years of social scandals. "I've seen men destroyed by bad investments, criminal charges, even adultery. But this, abandoning your pregnant wife and children? In our circles, that's unforgivable." "Those boys are remarkable," Senator Whitfield added, shaking her head in amazement. "Look at them, not an ounce of resentment or anger. They're just curious about their origins. It's almost heartbreaking how well adjusted they are despite his abandonment. Because they weren't raised by him," Margaret Morton said sharply. "They were raised by a man who chose to love them. There's a difference between a biological father and a real father, and everyone in this room can see which one Alexander Cross is." Near the altar, Scott and Brian remained focused on Sydney with the single-minded determination of children seeking answers to questions that mattered to them. Their politeness never wavered, but their intellectual curiosity was relentless. "Mr. Potter," Scott continued with the formal courtesy that had been ingrained in him since childhood, "when you decided to leave our mother, did you consider the possibility that she might be pregnant?" The question hit Sydney like a punch to the stomach. Had he considered it? In the weeks before he'd left, Marilyn had been tired, emotional, her body changing in subtle ways that he'd attributed to stress about their relationship. If he'd been paying attention, if he'd cared enough to look beyond his own selfish desires, he might have noticed the signs. "No," he admitted, the words feeling like confessions extracted under torture. "I didn't think about that." "Why not?" Brian asked with the mathematical precision that made him terrifying in any logical discussion. "According to medical statistics, the probability of pregnancy in sexually active married couples who don't use consistent contraception is approximately 85% within the first year. You were married for 5 years. The statistical likelihood of at least one pregnancy was virtually certain. The clinical way Brian presented the facts, reducing Sydney's marriage to statistics and probabilities, somehow made his abandonment seem even more callous. He'd left not just his wife, but the statistical certainty of children without ever bothering to confirm or deny their existence. "I wasn't thinking clearly," Sydney said desperately. "I was young, confused about what I wanted." "But Mom knew what she wanted," Scott interrupted gently. "She wanted a family. She wanted love. She wanted someone who would stay." Those aren't confusing concepts. The simplicity of his statement, delivered without judgment, but carrying the weight of absolute truth, cut through Sydney's excuses like a blade through tissue paper. Yes, Marilyn had known what she wanted. She'd wanted exactly what these boys had received from Manuel: unwavering love, consistent presence, the security of knowing they were chosen every single day. Around the room, the wedding guests were beginning to move, conversations becoming more animated as the full implications of what they'd witnessed began to sink in. This wasn't just gossip. This was a fundamental revelation about Sydney Potter's character that would reshape every business relationship, every social interaction, every aspect of his life in their rarefied world. "I need to speak with my husband," Tiffany said suddenly, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from recognizing a crisis that required immediate damage control. "Privately." She looked around the room, as if seeing it clearly for the first time. 300 of the most powerful people in America, all witnesses to her groom's public humiliation. Their faces showed everything from pity to contempt to barely concealed satisfaction at watching someone else's downfall unfold in real time. "I think," Marilyn spoke for the first time since the introductions, her voice carrying easily through the silent room. "Perhaps Sydney and Tiffany should have some time to process this information." It was a gesture of mercy that somehow made Sydney's humiliation complete. She wasn't gloating over his downfall. She was giving him privacy to experience it fully. The woman he'd abandoned was now protecting him from further embarrassment, and everyone in the room recognized the grace in the gesture. "Boys," Manuel said gently, placing protective hands on his son's shoulders, "I think we should give them some space." "But we haven't finished our conversation," Scott protested, his curiosity clearly unsatisfied. "There will be other opportunities," Marilyn said, though something in her tone suggested there wouldn't be many. As the Cross family began to withdraw, Sydney found his voice. "Wait," he called desperately. "Please, I have to." They turned back to him, 3 generations of dignity and success waiting politely for him to finish his sentence. But Sydney Potter, who'd built a career on smooth words and polished presentations, couldn't find the language for this moment. "Thank you," he said finally, the words completely inadequate, "for letting them meet me, for raising them so well, for everything." Marilyn nodded once, her queen acknowledging a subject's gratitude, and then she was gone, taking with her the husband who'd chosen to love her, and the sons who'd grown up magnificent without their biological father. Sydney was left standing at his wedding altar, watching his past walk away forever, while around him 300 witnesses began the whispered conversations that would destroy his reputation before the sun set. In the bridal suite 20 minutes later, Tiffany paced like a caged animal, while Sydney sat slumped in a Louis XV chair, his perfect wedding attire wrinkled from the weight of his despair. Her wedding dress rustled with each agitated step, diamonds scattering from her elaborate hairstyle like falling stars. $2.7 billion, she said, her voice hollow with disbelief. "That's not money, Sydney. That's a small country's GDP. Tiffany, please. Please what?" She whirled to face him, and Sydney realized he was seeing the real Tiffany Blake for the first time. Not the sweet, compliant woman who'd hung on his every word, but someone with steel beneath the silk, calculation behind the beauty. "Please pretend I didn't just discover that you abandoned a woman who's worth more than some multinational corporations. Please ignore the fact that you have 2 children you never told me about. Please act like 300 people didn't just watch me realize I'm marrying down so far. It's practically subterranean." The venom in her voice was matched by the cold calculation in her eyes. This wasn't just about hurt feelings or shattered trust. This was about Tiffany realizing that she'd attached herself to a sinking ship just moments before it hit the iceberg. "I didn't know about the boys," Sydney said desperately. "You have to believe me, Tiffany. I wouldn't have what? Abandoned your pregnant wife. Oh wait, you did exactly that." Her laugh was bitter, cutting through the room like broken glass. "You just got lucky that she didn't tell you about the pregnancy first. That's not fair. I was different then, younger. You were exactly who you are now." Tiffany cut him off with surgical precision. "A man who chooses himself over everyone else. Who sees relationships as stepping stones rather than commitments. Who walks away when things get difficult or inconvenient." She moved to the antique mirror, staring at her reflection with the kind of harsh assessment usually reserved for mortal enemies. "Do you know what I realized out there, watching those perfect children meet their father for the first time? I realized that I'm exactly like you. I chose you because I thought you represented success, security, access to a world I wanted to join. But that woman, your first wife, she showed me what real success looks like." Sydney watched as Tiffany began removing the diamond hairpins from her elaborate updo, each piece falling to the carpet like tears made of crystal. "What are you doing?" "What I should have done the moment those beautiful boys walked up and called you their father," she said, her voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "I'm saving myself." She pulled out her phone, her manicured fingers flying over the screen with the efficiency of someone conducting emergency surgery. "Look at this. Twitter is exploding. The Potter wedding is trending, and not in a good way. Billionaire's ex-wife crashes cheating husband's wedding with the kids he abandoned. Cross family shows up Sidney Potter at his own ceremony. When karma comes in designer clothes and speaks through 10-year-olds. Sidney watched in horror as Tiffany scrolled through post after post, each one more damaging than the last. Photos of the Cross family's entrance were already going viral, with commenters dissecting every detail of their obvious wealth and happiness. Someone had identified Scott and Brian's elite private school, their academic achievements, their parents' charitable work. Someone else had posted a timeline of Sidney's rise to success, alongside speculation about when he'd abandoned his pregnant wife. "This is a disaster," he whispered. "This is justice," Tiffany corrected, setting her phone aside and beginning to gather her things. "And I refuse to be collateral damage in your moral reckoning." She walked to the ornate desk and picked up the marriage license they'd signed that morning, along with the prenuptial agreements and insurance documents that would have legally bound their lives together. With deliberate precision, she began tearing them into pieces. "What are you doing?" Sidney asked, though he already knew. "What I should have done the moment I realized you were capable of abandoning pregnant women and children," Tiffany said, scattering the shredded papers like confetti. "I'm protecting myself from being associated with a man who values ambition more than family and somehow ended up with less of both than the woman he threw away." The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. That was exactly what had happened. He'd chosen success over love and ended up with neither, while Marilyn had transformed his abandonment into both. "But you love me," Sidney said desperately, grasping for anything that might stop this free fall. Tiffany paused in her destruction, looking at him with something approaching pity. "I loved what I thought you represented, Sidney. Success, security, access to a world I thought I wanted. But that woman out there, your first wife, she showed me what real success looks like, what real power looks like, what it means to turn rejection into resurrection." She picked up her purse and moved toward the door, pausing at the threshold without turning around. "I'll have my things moved out of your apartment by tomorrow. Consider yourself lucky that prenups work both ways. You're protected from any claims I might make." "Tiffany, wait." "Goodbye, Sidney. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for. But more than that, I hope you eventually realize what you already had and threw away." The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like a coffin lid falling shut. Sidney sat alone in the bridal suite, surrounded by the debris of his destroyed wedding, listening to the sounds of guests who'd come to celebrate his triumph but had stayed to witness his annihilation. Through the window, he could see the Cross family on the club's terrace, Manuel listening intently as Scott pointed out architectural details of the building, Brian apparently explaining something complex with elaborate hand gestures, Marilyn laughing at something her husband whispered in her ear. They looked like what they were, a family so secure in their love for each other that external chaos couldn't touch them. Sidney's phone buzzed with messages, reporters wanting statements, business associates expressing concern, social media notifications showing how quickly his humiliation was spreading across the internet. But he ignored them all, transfixed by the sight of the life he'd rejected, now flourishing beyond his reach. As the sun set over the Meridian Club, Sidney Potter sat alone in a room designed for joy, watching through a window as his past walked away from him forever, taking with it any hope of redemption, reconciliation, or peace. The unraveling had only just begun, but already Sidney understood that this wasn't just the end of his wedding. It was the end of the life he'd spent 10 years building on the foundation of his cruelest choice, and the most devastating part was knowing that he had no one to blame but himself. Chapter 8. The Business Empire Crumbles. In the world of high finance, moral bankruptcy is the only kind that matters. The financial obituary of Sidney Potter began at exactly 8:47 a.m. on the Monday morning after his wedding that wasn't, when Finch Wellington, heir to a banking fortune that predated the Civil War, placed a call to his chief investment officer with instructions that would ripple through Manhattan's financial district like a controlled demolition. Remove Potter Industries from all our portfolios, Wellington said, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone who moved billions with phone calls. All holdings, all partnerships, everything. I don't care about the losses. Sir, may I ask why? Potter's been a solid performer, and the fundamentals. Because I don't do business with men who abandon pregnant wives and children. Wellington cut him off with the finality of a church bell tolling. And neither should anyone else with functioning morals. By 9:15 a.m., Potter Industries' stock had dropped 15%. By noon, it was in complete free fall. Sidney sat in his corner office, the one he'd fought so viciously to earn, decorated with awards and photographs that chronicled his rise from working-class nothing to Manhattan elite, watching his computer screen display his company's financial destruction in real time. Each refresh showed more red numbers, more sell orders, more evidence that his 10-minute encounter with his past had destroyed his future more efficiently than any terrorist attack or natural disaster. His assistant, Margaret, knocked and entered without waiting for permission, a liberty she'd never taken in 8 years of employment. But the rules seemed different now that her boss had been publicly revealed as a man who abandoned children. She carried a tablet and wore the expression of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. "Mr. Potter, I have the damage report," she said, though nothing in her tone suggested sympathy. Wellington Holdings liquidated their entire position at market open. Blackwood Capital followed at 9:30. The Morrison Trust terminated their consulting contract via email. They didn't even call. Sidney nodded numbly. These weren't just business partnerships. They were the foundation of his social standing, his entry into circles where money alone couldn't buy admission. You needed reputation, connections, the kind of moral credibility that took decades to build and could be destroyed in a single viral moment. Also, Margaret continued with the efficient brutality of someone reading a coroner's report. The Times wants a statement about Saturday's incident. So does the Wall Street Journal. Forbes, CNN, and approximately 47 social media influencers with more followers than most countries have citizens. What kind of statement? Sidney asked, though he already knew there was no statement that could fix this. They're calling it the wedding crash that broke Wall Street, Margaret said dryly. Someone leaked high-definition video footage of your encounter with your sons. It's been viewed 12 million times since Sunday. Sidney closed his eyes, imagining those innocent faces on screens around the world, their devastating questions echoing in languages he didn't speak, their casual destruction of his reputation becoming entertainment for millions of strangers. The internet had transformed his children's natural curiosity about their biological father into a global phenomenon about karma, justice, and the price of abandoning family for ambition. Sir, Margaret's voice carried a note of something that might have been concern if she hadn't been updating her resume between tasks. There's something else. What now? John Industries made an offer to buy Potter Industries this morning. Full market value plus 30% cash. The words hit Sidney like ice water in his veins. Manuel John wants to buy my company? See, not just any company, Margaret corrected with brutal honesty. Your company, specifically. The offer came with a personal note from Mrs. Marilyn Cross saying she thought it was important to protect your employees from the consequences of your personal choices. Sidney stared at the formal offer letter Margaret placed on his desk, recognizing the subtle knife thrust wrapped in apparent kindness. Marilyn wasn't trying to destroy his company. She was trying to save it from the destruction his own actions had caused, which somehow made his humiliation complete. "She's offering to rescue me," he whispered. "Rescue is the wrong word," Margaret said with devastating clarity. "She's offering to prevent innocent people from suffering because of your moral failures. There's a difference." The difference, Sydney realized, was the difference between charity and justice. Marilyn wasn't trying to save him. She was protecting the employees whose livelihoods depended on Potter Industries' survival. It was exactly the kind of thing someone who'd built an empire based on genuine leadership rather than desperate ambition would do. His direct phone line rang, the number reserved for his most important clients. Sydney glanced at the caller ID, Senator Patricia Whitfield, whose family trust represented one of his largest accounts and whose endorsement had opened doors throughout Washington's political establishment. "Patricia," he answered, trying to inject normalcy into his voice. "Sydney." Her tone carried the chill of a December morning in Maine. "I'm calling as a courtesy. Since our families have known each other for 20 years, the Whitfield Trust will be moving our account to John Industries, effective immediately. Patricia, surely we can discuss." "There's nothing to discuss." Her voice carried the kind of finality usually reserved for death sentences. "My granddaughter watched that video of you meeting those beautiful boys, and she asked me why a daddy would leave his children before they were born. Do you know what I told her?" Sydney remained silent, though he could feel the executioner's blade hovering above his neck. "I told her that some people choose themselves over the people they're supposed to protect, and those people don't deserve to handle our family's money. Goodbye, Sydney. I hope those boys grow up to be better men than their father." The line went dead, with the finality of a coffin lid closing. Sydney set the phone down with hands that shook slightly, watching his computer screen refresh with more red numbers, more evidence of a professional annihilation that was as swift as it was complete. By Tuesday, Potter Industries had lost 60% of its value. By Thursday, Sydney had received 23 offers to sell his company, most of them vulture capitalism disguised as rescue attempts, firms that specialized in buying distressed assets and stripping them for parts. But Manuel John's offer remained on his desk, generous and straightforward, the kind of deal that would ensure his employees kept their jobs and his clients received uninterrupted service. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who'd married his ex-wife was now offering to save the company Sydney had built after abandoning her. It was mercy wrapped in business efficiency, and it tasted like ashes in his mouth. On Friday, Sydney sat in the conference room where he'd once celebrated his first $1 million deal, facing his senior partners, men he'd considered friends, allies in the war for financial supremacy. Their faces showed the kind of expression usually reserved for terminal illness diagnoses. "The situation is unsustainable," said Richard Hayes, his managing partner for 6 years. "We're hemorrhaging clients faster than we can count them. Our credit lines are being called in, and the board is demanding immediate action." "It'll blow over," Sydney said weakly, though even he didn't believe it anymore. "These things always do." "No," said Jennifer, his head of client relations, with the brutal honesty that had made her invaluable in better times. "This won't blow over. You didn't just have a scandal, Sydney. You became the living embodiment of everything our client base despises. You abandoned your family for money and ended up with less of both than the woman you left behind. In our world, that's not just immoral, it's incompetent." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Immoral could be forgiven, explained away, rationalized with enough time and expensive public relations. But incompetent, that was permanent exile from the halls of power. "We need to accept the John Industries offer," Richard said quietly. "It's the only way to save what we can." Sydney looked around the table at faces that had once looked at him with respect, admiration, even envy. Now they showed nothing but professional obligation to clean up his mess as efficiently as possible. "Fine," he said, the word coming out like a sigh of surrender. "Accept it." The next morning, Sidney Potter signed papers transferring Potter Industries to John Industries for $400 million, money that would be distributed to partners, employees and creditors, leaving him with enough to maintain his lifestyle, but not enough to maintain his position in the world he'd fought so hard to enter. Manuel John handled the transition with the kind of smooth professionalism that made billionaires out of ambitious men. He retained every employee, honored every client contract, and seamlessly absorbed Potter Industries into his empire as if acquiring companies was as routine as buying coffee. More importantly, he did it all without once mentioning Sidney's personal failures or moral bankruptcies. The only personal touch was a handwritten note from Marilyn, delivered with the final contracts. "Thank you for allowing us to protect your employees' futures. They deserve leaders who understand that success without integrity is just failure wearing expensive clothes." Even in victory, she was gracious. Even in his defeat, she was kind. It made Sidney's humiliation complete and his isolation absolute. As he cleared out his office for the last time, packing awards and photographs into boxes that would gather dust in storage, Sidney Potter realized he'd achieved the one thing he'd never wanted. He'd become a cautionary tale, a living example of what happened when ambition overcame conscience and greed defeated grace. Somewhere across the city, in offices that now bore the John Industries name, his former employees were discovering what it felt like to work for people who valued family as much as profit. Somewhere in Manhattan, his ex-wife was building something magnificent from the ashes of what he'd destroyed. And somewhere in an elite private school, his sons were learning mathematics and languages and the kind of confidence that came from being genuinely loved. Sidney Potter had gambled everything on the belief that success without love was still success. Now, sitting alone in his empty office, surrounded by boxes and broken dreams, he was learning that some bets could never be won, only lost more completely than he'd ever imagined possible. The empire he'd built had crumbled, but the real tragedy was the realization that it had been built on sand from the very beginning. He'd spent 10 years constructing a life based on the foundation of his cruelest choice, and now that foundation had shifted, revealing the moral bankruptcy that had always lurked beneath his financial success. Through his office windows, Sidney could see the city where he'd once imagined himself a king, now understanding himself to be just another subject in someone else's kingdom. Somewhere out there, Manuel John was building something real with the woman Sidney had thrown away and the children he'd never known he'd abandoned. The revenge was complete, but it looked nothing like what Sidney had expected. It wasn't his destruction. It was their construction of something so beautiful that his absence had become irrelevant. And that, Sidney realized as he closed his office door for the last time, was the most perfect revenge of all. Chapter 9. The most beautiful revenge. The most perfect revenge is not destruction. It's grace so complete that it transforms the destroyer. 6 months after the wedding that became a funeral for Sidney Potter's reputation, autumn painted Central Park in shades of gold and scarlet, while Manhattan's elite prepared for the winter social season. In the penthouse offices of John Industries, Marilyn stood at floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city spread beneath her like a conquered kingdom. Though conquest had never been her goal, merely survival, then success, then finally, unexpectedly, a peace so profound it felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. The intercom chimed softly with Janet's voice, warm with the affection that had replaced professional distance over the years of their friendship. Mrs. John, there's someone here to see you. He says it's personal." Marilyn smiled at Janet's persistent struggle with her name changes. She'd kept Dave professionally, added Cross during her brief first marriage to Alexander, and was now legally Mrs. Manuel John. though the business world still knew her primarily as Marilyn Dave. The complexity of her identity seemed fitting for a woman who'd been broken and rebuilt so many times. If she'd lost count, she didn't need to ask who was waiting. She'd been expecting this visit for months, ever since the financial papers announced that Sydney Potter had quietly moved to a modest apartment on the Upper West Side and taken a position teaching business ethics at Columbia, a career change that had raised eyebrows throughout Manhattan's financial district, but somehow felt inevitable. To anyone who'd witnessed his public reckoning, "Send him in," she said quietly, settling behind her desk with the kind of composed calm that had negotiated billion-dollar deals and diffused international crises. Sydney entered her office like a man walking into church, humble, uncertain, carrying himself with the careful dignity that belonged to people who'd learned the difference between confidence and humility the hard way. 6 months had changed him in ways that went beyond the grey threading through his hair or the lines around his eyes. He moved with the slower pace of someone who'd stopped running toward something and started walking toward himself. "Hello, Marilyn," he said, and his voice carried none of the smooth authority she remembered. Instead, it held the rough honesty of someone who'd stopped performing for an audience and started speaking his truth, however uncomfortable it might be. Sydney, she gestured toward the sitting area where she conducted her most important conversations. Leather chairs arranged around a coffee table that had hosted negotiations worth billions. "Please, sit." They faced each other across mahogany and history, two people who'd once shared everything and now shared only the genetics of children who barely knew one of them existed. Through the windows, Central Park stretched green and gold beneath October skies that seemed to promise either winter or renewal, depending on your perspective. "I saw the article in Business Insider," Sydney said quietly, settling into his chair with the careful movements of someone who'd learned not to take comfort for granted. "About the new scholarship fund, the Potter John Foundation for Children of Single Parents." Marilyn's expression didn't change, though something warm flickered in her eyes. "You saw that, using my name, after everything." He shook his head with something that might have been wonder if it hadn't been so tinged with self-recrimination. "I don't understand why." "Because," Marilyn said simply, her voice carrying the kind of certainty that came from making peace with difficult truths, "those children need help, and you're Scott and Brian's biological father. Despite everything that happened between us, they carry your genetic heritage as part of theirs. If that heritage can help other children whose parents made difficult choices, then it should." Sydney stared at her, this woman who'd transformed his abandonment into her foundation, who'd turned his cruelty into her strength, who was now using his failure to create something beautiful for others. "I don't deserve that kindness." "No," she agreed, and her honesty was more healing than any false comfort could have been. "You don't, but they do. The children we help." "The children we help," she corrected gently, and the word "we" hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossibly wide chasm. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two former spouses finding an unexpected peace in the ruins of their marriage. Outside, Manhattan bustled with the energy of 8 million people building their lives. While inside this office, two people who'd once shared everything discovered they could share forgiveness. "How are they?" Sydney asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Scott and Brian? They're magnificent," Marilyn said, and her face lit up with the kind of joy that only came from talking about beloved children. "Scott just won first place in a national architecture competition for students under 12. His design was for sustainable housing that could be assembled anywhere in the world in under a week. Brian has been accepted to a special mathematics program at MIT. He'll attend weekend classes while finishing elementary school." "They're 10, Sydney said, amazement coloring his voice. "They're exceptional," Marilyn corrected, "and they know they're loved. That makes all the difference." "Do they?" Sydney struggled with the words, afraid of the answer but needing to know. Do they ask about me? I guess sometimes. They're curious about genetics, medical history, the traits they inherited from you. Marilyn's voice softened slightly, showing him a mercy he hadn't dared hope for. They're not angry with you, Sydney. They never have been. You can't be angry at someone who was never important enough to hurt you. The words were devastating, precisely because they weren't meant to be cruel, they were simply true. His sons had grown up so complete, so loved, so secure that his absence hadn't created wounds so much as a mild curiosity about missing information. I would like to know them, Sydney said carefully. The words feeling like a prayer he wasn't sure he deserved to pray. Not as their father. Manuel is their father in every way that matters. But maybe as someone who cares about their well-being, someone who could answer their questions about family history and genetics. That would be up to them, Marilyn said, though her tone suggested she wouldn't object. They're old enough to decide for themselves what kind of relationship, if any, they want with you. And you? Would you be comfortable with that? Marilyn was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the city she'd conquered through intelligence and determination, rather than abandonment and ambition. When she spoke, her voice carried the wisdom of someone who'd learned that the best revenge was not destruction, but transcendence. I was angry with you for a very long time, she said finally, each word chosen with care. Not just for leaving, but for the timing, for the cruelty, for never checking to see if I was all right, for making me feel like I wasn't worth staying for. You were worth everything, Sydney said quietly, and the simple truth of it hung between them like an apology he'd never been able to make. I know that now, Marilyn replied, and there was no bitterness in her voice, only the calm certainty of someone who'd found her worth reflected in other eyes. But it took me years to understand that your leaving said nothing about my value and everything about your capacity to recognize it. She turned to look at him directly, and Sydney saw in her eyes the woman she'd become, not despite his abandonment, but because of how she'd transformed his worst act into her greatest strength. I forgave you, Sydney, she said simply. Not because you deserved it, but because I did. Because carrying anger for 10 years was exhausting, and I realized you'd taken enough from me. I wasn't going to let you take my peace too. The words hit him like a benediction he'd never dared hope for. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. But if you're going to be in my sons' lives in any capacity, you need to understand something fundamental. They don't need you. They want for nothing, not love, not security, not guidance, not support. Manuel provides everything they need and more. If you're going to know them, it has to be because you have something genuine to offer, not because you're trying to fill some void in their lives that doesn't exist. Sydney nodded, understanding that this was both a possibility and a warning. What could I offer them? Honesty, Marilyn said immediately. The truth about mistakes and consequences and the real cost of choosing ambition over love. They're brilliant boys, but they're growing up in a world where everything comes easily. Maybe they could benefit from knowing someone who learned important lessons the hard way. A cautionary tale in human form, Sydney said with a rueful smile that held more self-awareness than she'd ever seen from him. A teacher, Marilyn corrected gently. Which is what you've become, isn't it? Before Sydney could answer, the office door opened and Manuel entered with Scott and Brian flanking him like young princes. The boys had grown in the months since the wedding, taller, more confident, carrying themselves with the easy grace of children who'd never doubted their place in the world. Mom, Scott said, his artist's eye immediately cataloguing the tension in the room. Janet said our biological father was here. Is this about the genetics questions we submitted for our science project? Brian asked, his mathematical mind already calculating probabilities and outcomes. Manuel moved to stand behind Marilyn's chair, his hands settling on her shoulders in a gesture of support that spoke of years of partnership and absolute trust. At 45, he was more handsome than ever, success and happiness having given him the kind of confidence that made other men look diminished by comparison. "Boys," Marilyn said gently, "Mr. Potter came to see me about the Scholarship Foundation. But since you're here, perhaps you'd like to ask him those questions directly." Scott and Brian exchanged one of their wordless twin communications before approaching Sydney, with the same polite curiosity they'd shown at the wedding. They weren't nervous or excited or angry, just intellectually engaged with a problem that interested them. "We've been studying inherited traits versus environmental influences," Scott said, settling into a chair across from Sydney with perfect posture. "We wanted to know about your family medical history and genetic predispositions. Also your educational background and career trajectory," Brian added, pulling out a small notebook with the efficiency of someone conducting a formal interview. "We're comparing your path to Dad's to understand different models of success." The casual way Brian referred to Manuel as Dad, not stepfather or adoptive father, just Dad, made Sydney's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. These boys had never needed him, had never wondered about him, had never felt his absence as loss, because their lives had been so full of love. "I'd be happy to answer your questions," Sydney said, and meant it with a sincerity that surprised him. "Though I should warn you that my path to success wasn't nearly as admirable as your father's." "That's why it's interesting," Scott said, with the wisdom of an artist who understood that flawed subjects often made the best studies. Dad's path was pretty straightforward. He identified problems, created solutions, and helped people. Your path involved more complicated choices. Suboptimal decision-making, Brian clarified with devastating accuracy. "We want to understand the psychological and economic factors that led to those choices." Manuel laughed softly, the sound carrying genuine warmth. "Your sons have no respect for emotional complexity. Marilyn, they get that from me," she said, smiling at her husband with the easy affection that still made Sydney's absence feel like the gift it had turned out to be. For the next hour, Scott and Brian conducted what felt like the world's most polite interrogation, asking questions about family medical history, educational choices, career decisions, and the factors that had influenced Sydney's major life choices. They showed no judgment, only curiosity, treating him like a case study rather than a person who'd caused their mother pain. "One final question," Scott said as their interview wound down. "Do you regret leaving our mother?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, though it was asked with genuine curiosity rather than accusation. Sydney looked at these remarkable boys, his biological sons who'd grown up to be everything he might have been if he'd been raised with love instead of ambition, and gave them the truth they deserved. "Every day," he said quietly, "leaving your mother was the stupidest thing I've ever done. She was the best person I've ever known, and I threw away her love because I was too selfish and too scared to recognize its value." "But if you hadn't left," Brian observed with mathematical precision, "we wouldn't have Dad, and Mom wouldn't be as successful as she is now. Your bad decision led to our family's good fortune." The logic was inescapable and somehow comforting. Sydney's worst act had cleared the path for their best life. "That's true," Sydney agreed. "Your mother turned my abandonment into her strength, my cruelty into her kindness, my failure into your family's success. She's remarkable." "We know," Scott said simply. "Everyone knows. That's why we're not angry with you. We're grateful. If you hadn't left, we wouldn't have the family we have now." As the boys gathered their notebooks and prepared to leave, Scott paused by Sydney's chair. "Mr. Potter, if you want to know us better, you could come to our school science fair next month. We're presenting our research on genetic inheritance versus environmental factors. You're part of our data set." "I'd like that very much," Sydney said, his voice thick with emotion he didn't try to hide. After the boys left with Manuel, who nodded politely to Sydney but said nothing, his silence more powerful than any words could have been, Marilyn and Sydney sat alone once more. They're extraordinary, Sydney said finally. Yes, they are. And they know exactly who they are and where they belong. That's what love does. It creates security so complete that even meeting the man who abandoned them becomes just another interesting experience. Sydney stood to leave, pausing at the door. Marilyn, thank you for raising them so well, for being the mother they deserved, for turning my worst choice into their best life. Thank you, she replied, for making the choice that led me to Manuel. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you clears the path for the best thing. That evening, in the John family's penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, Marilyn sat in Manuel's arms, watching their sons do homework at the kitchen island. Scott was sketching architectural improvements for their school's playground, while Brian calculated the cost-benefit analysis of various construction materials. How do you feel? Manuel asked, his voice carrying the gentle concern that had first made her fall in love with him. Free, Marilyn said simply. Finally completely free. Sydney isn't the monster I spent years making him in my mind, and he isn't the prince I once thought he was. He's just a man who made terrible choices and is learning to live with the consequences. And the boys? The boys are exactly where they belong, she said, watching Scott and Brian work together on their project with the easy cooperation of children who'd never doubted they were a team. They have their father, you, and now they have answers to their questions about genetics. It's perfect closure. Manuel pressed a kiss to her temple, and Marilyn marveled at how different this love felt from what she'd shared with Sydney. This was deeper, richer, built on mutual respect and shared values, rather than desperate need and romantic fantasy. I love you. Mrs. John, Manuel murmured against her ear. I love you too. Mr. John, thank you for being exactly what Sydney never was, a man who stays, who chooses love over ambition, who makes our children feel like they're the greatest gift in the world. As the sun set over Manhattan, painting their home in shades of gold and amber, Marilyn Dave John realized that the most beautiful revenge hadn't been Sydney's destruction, it had been her construction of something so magnificent that his absence had become irrelevant. She turned his leaving into her arriving, his rejection into her selection by a man who loved her without reservation, his abandonment into her family's foundation of unshakable strength. The revenge was complete, and it was more beautiful than anything she could have imagined.